The press conference was a battlefield long before the cage. Lights blazed. Cameras fired like machine guns. The Irish fighter leaned forward, smirk dripping arrogance. His words sliced the air like broken glass. "Your father's a coward. You drink like a peasant." Gasps. Laughter. Shock. The crowd roared in chaos. But the Muslim fighter? He sat still. Eyes sharp. Face carved in stone. Silence heavier than any punch. The insult poisoned the room. It wasn't trash talk. It was blasphemy against blood. Against legacy. Nobody knew the truth. This so-called silent man was undefeated. Every jab, every counter, sharpened under the very father now mocked. The Irish fighter strutted, convinced he had won the mental war. But silence is a weapon. And storms strike without warning. When the cage door locks, 20 seconds will change everything. Backhand index pointing right. Where are you watching the video? Comment, and if you like the video, please subscribe and like the channel. The night was restless. The city hummed with neon lights and restless whispers, as if it already knew that two men were about to collide in a storm no one could stop. One carried arrogance like armor. The other carried silence like a blade. Their paths were set, but their worlds could not have been further apart. The Irish fighter had always loved the spotlight. Born into chaos, raised on a diet of cheap alcohol and violent streets, he was a product of defiance. Fights were his currency. Trouble followed him like a shadow. Teachers called him unteachable. Neighbors called him dangerous. He called himself inevitable. Bars and back alleys had been his first arenas. Drunken laughter, the smell of stale beer, the taste of blood on his tongue, this was home. He was reckless, brutal, and raw. Talent was undeniable, but discipline? Non-existent. Yet promoters loved him. The chaos he carried was marketable, a wildfire they could sell tickets for. The louder he shouted, the more fans he drew. And he knew it. By the time he entered professional fighting, arrogance had already become his second skin. He taunted opponents, mocked their families, ridiculed their faiths. It wasn't just fighting, it was humiliation as performance art. He fed off hatred as much as he did cheers. And in that poisoned balance, his ego grew monstrous. But arrogance is a fragile mask. Behind the smirk lived a broken boy who once watched his father stagger drunk into darkness, fists flying at shadows. Violence wasn't learned, it was inherited. Pain had been his only inheritance. Instead of healing, he sharpened it into a weapon. He swore he would never be powerless again. In his world, dominance was survival. Respect wasn't earned, it was stolen. Across the ocean, in a quiet town kissed by mountains, a different story was being written. The Muslim fighter's childhood was one of discipline, prayer, and relentless training. His father was not a man of wealth, but a man of steel and wisdom. Every morning, before dawn's first light, father and son would run together through misty fields, the boy's lungs burning as his father's voice echoed, "Patience builds strength. Silence sharpens focus." The gym was no palace. Cracked mats, worn gloves, heavy bags patched more times than he could count. But it was sacred. It was where he learned not just how to fight, but how to endure. His father drilled humility into every strike, every hold. You fight not to prove yourself better. You fight to master yourself. Where the Irish fighter's nights ended in smoke-filled bars, the Muslim fighter's nights ended in prayer and discipline. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing mastery. Every bead of sweat was a tribute to the man who raised him. Every bruise, every scar, a reminder that his father's teachings were carved into his flesh. As he grew, his reputation spread quietly but undeniably. He didn't boast. He didn't mock. He let victories speak in silence. Undefeated. Relentless. Opponents underestimated him because he didn't play the game of theatrics. He didn't bark at press conferences or throw chairs at weigh-ins. He walked in calm and walked out with his hand raised. Again and again. But while silence was his strength, it also painted a target on his back. Promoters, hungry for drama, longed for someone to crack that calm. And the Irish fighter was their chosen weapon. He was fire to the Muslim fighter's still water. He was chaos against discipline. To them, it was perfect storytelling. To the Irishman, it was personal theater. In the weeks leading up to the fight, their worlds began to overlap. The Irish fighter gave interviews drenched in venom. He called his opponent weak. He mocked his religion, twisted his culture into insults. And worst of all, he attacked the very man who had built the undefeated fighter, the father. "Your old man is nothing. A drunk like the rest of them." The words burned across headlines. Clips went viral. Fans cheered the arrogance, while others seethed with rage. For the Irish fighter, it was strategy. Break the man before the cage. Make him emotional, reckless. Humiliate him into mistakes. He had done it before. He thought he could do it again. But in silence, the Muslim fighter trained harder. Every insult was fuel. Every headline was fire. His father, calm as ever, reminded him, "Let him speak. Let his words weigh on him. You will answer only when the time is right." And so he said nothing. He showed nothing. His silence rattled the Irishman more than anger ever could. Meanwhile, the Irish fighter celebrated his own bravado. Nights blurred into neon haze, drinks flowing, cameras capturing every boast. He told his team, "I'll put him down in one round. I'll embarrass him in front of the world." They laughed, nodded, fueled his delusion. The press ate it up. Arrogance sold tickets. Disrespect filled arenas. But arrogance blinds. And in that blindness, he could not see the storm that silence was building. The contrast could not be sharper. One man fed on chaos. The other grew from discipline. One laughed at pain. The other carried it with quiet dignity. The cage would not be big enough for both. In the final days before fight night, the Irish fighter sharpened his words instead of his strikes. He plotted not just victory, but humiliation. He wanted the knockout. He wanted to stand over his fallen opponent, taunting, laughing, proving his dominance. He rehearsed the insults he would scream into the microphone. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that silence had already decided the outcome. The storm was waiting, 20 seconds away. And as he drifted into sleep on the eve of battle, arrogance wrapped around him like a blanket. He believed he had already won. But storms strike hardest when skies look calm. The press conference wasn't meant to be a fight, but it felt like one. The air inside the room was thick with heat, heavy with noise. Reporters jostled for position. Cameras fired in rapid bursts. Microphones crowded the table like weapons waiting to be used. Fans packed the back rows, some chanting, some heckling, the tension already boiling. The Irish fighter thrived in this chaos. He leaned forward, sunglasses low on his nose, smirk sharp enough to cut glass. He loved the stage, loved the smell of adrenaline and sweat mixing with stale coffee from reporters' cups. This was his arena long before the cage. Words were his fists, and he threw them recklessly. "You're a fraud," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You sit there, silent like some monk. But I see you. You're weak. You hide behind your religion. Behind your father. He's nothing. A drunk. Just like you'll be when I'm finished." Gasps filled the room. Some fans laughed, roaring in approval. Others hissed, their voices drowned out by the sheer audacity of the insult. The Muslim fighter sat motionless. His jaw clenched. His eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on his opponent. But still, silence. The Irish fighter thrived on reaction, but silence unnerved him. He banged his fist on the table, trying to stir the quiet. "Say something," he barked. "Anything. Or are you too scared?" Still, no response. Only the weight of silence pressing heavier against the walls. The cameras zoomed in, desperate to catch a flicker of emotion, a crack in the mask. But there was none. The Muslim fighter's breathing was steady. His posture unshaken. For him, words were cheap. He remembered his father's lessons. Do not waste your strength on noise. The world will tempt you to react. Let your answer come in the moment that matters. And so he waited. Reporters scribbled furiously. The headlines were already being written, "Irish fighter breaks silent opponent." Promoters smiled in the back of the room. This was drama they could sell. Controversy was currency. The louder the insult, the bigger the payday. The Irish fighter sensed victory. Not in the cage yet, But here, in the battle of perception, he leaned closer, lowering his voice to a hiss meant only for his opponent but loud enough for the microphones to catch. "When I knock you down, I'll spit on the ground where your father's name belongs." A murmur ran through the crowd. The cruelty was beyond trash talk. It was venomous. Lines had been crossed, and the audience felt it. Faces twisted in discomfort. Even some of his own fans shifted uneasily. But the Irishman didn't care. He wanted to wound, to provoke, to break. The Muslim fighter inhaled slowly. Exhaled. His silence was not weakness. It was restraint sharpened into a blade. His eyes never left the man across from him, but his lips never parted. Inside, his father's voice echoed again, "Let them think silence means fear. It means patience. And patience is undefeated." The press conference descended into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, fans screamed insults, and security tightened their circle. Yet through the noise, one image stood stark and unforgettable. The Irish fighter raging, shouting, spitting venom, while the Muslim fighter sat unmoved, silent as stone. Later, outside, the world reacted. Clips of the insults spread like wildfire across social media. The Irish fighter's fans celebrated his mind games. They flooded comment sections with laughter and mockery. But just as loud were the voices of outrage. Millions condemned the disrespect, calling it an attack not just on a fighter, but on family, on faith, on legacy itself. The Muslim fighter did not post a response. No angry tweets. No interviews. Nothing. His silence off the stage matched his silence on it. Instead, he was in the gym, sweat pouring, fists thudding against heavy bags, mind sharpened by focus. His father watched quietly, nodding with each disciplined strike. The son needed no words. The cage would speak for him. Meanwhile, the Irish fighter basked in the glow of controversy. He replayed clips of his own insults, laughing with his entourage. He drank, celebrated, convinced he had broken his opponent before the fight had even begun. "He's finished," he told his team. "You saw his face. Nothing behind those eyes. He's done." But his arrogance blinded him to the truth, that silence is not emptiness. It is the weight of storms waiting to break. Promoters leaned into the drama, plastering posters across cities, the arrogant Irishman sneering, the stoic Muslim glaring back in silence. They spun the narrative of humiliation, of a man too scared to respond. But inside the quiet fighter's camp, the story was different. His team knew. His father knew. He was not silent because he was broken. He was silent because he was ready. Back in the Irish fighter's hotel room, the celebration continued late into the night. He rehearsed his post-fight taunts in front of the mirror, imagining the crowd's roar. He pictured himself standing over his opponent's body, microphone in hand, spewing one last insult to cement his dominance. "Say something," he muttered to his reflection, grinning. "Say something when you're on the floor." But storms are deaf to arrogance. The press conference was supposed to be the Irish fighter's victory. In his mind, he had already won. Yet, in that very moment of triumph, the seeds of downfall had been planted. Every insult had built the silence into something heavier, something unstoppable. The Muslim fighter left the stage that night with the same calm he had entered with. No words. No anger. Just the promise of what was to come. His silence was not surrender, it was a warning. And when the cage door closed, silence would become thunder. The world saw silence. But inside the Muslim fighter's heart, silence was never empty. It was filled with echoes, memories carved deep, lessons that came not from books or classrooms, but from the calloused hands of his father. His father was not a man of riches. He had no banners hanging from gym rafters, no endorsements from shiny brands. He was a man of sweat, prayer, and scars. His youth had been a battlefield of survival, and his adulthood was an unending test of endurance. Life had given him little, but what he carried was priceless: discipline. Before dawn, when the city still slept and shadows swallowed the streets, father and son rose together. The boy's legs ached, lungs burned, but the man never slowed. "Patience," his father would say, his breath steady in the cold morning air. "Patience builds strength. Strength builds legacy." They ran through cracked alleys, across empty fields, the only sound their footsteps pounding in rhythm with the beating of their hearts. At sunrise, while neighbors were still tangled in sleep, they entered the gym. A gym that looked more like a ruin than a temple. Torn mats. Heavy bags patched with duct tape. Iron bars rusted from years of sweat and blood. Yet inside, it was sacred ground. Every strike was a prayer. Every round was a lesson. His father did not teach fighting as violence, but as discipline, as devotion. "The cage is not where you defeat others," he told his son. "It is where you defeat yourself. Ego, fear, doubt. Defeat them, and no man can touch you." The boy listened, absorbed, and grew. Years blurred into repetition. Morning runs, endless drills, bruises that turned skin into maps of sacrifice. His father's voice became the constant soundtrack of his youth. Hands up. Chin down. Breathe. Again. Silence was part of the lesson too. His father believed that arrogance poisoned a fighter faster than any punch. Trash talk was for the weak. "If you must speak," he said, "let it be truth. And truth is shown in action, not in words." So the boy learned to let silence shield him. While others boasted, he worked. While others celebrated, he trained. His victories were not shouted from rooftops. They were etched in the record books, one by one, undefeated. But behind every victory was the shadow of his father. Even now, as a man grown, standing on the brink of his greatest fight, he could feel his father's presence. The same lessons that had shaped his fists still carved paths in his mind. The insults hurled by the Irish fighter were not just insults, they were daggers aimed at his father's chest. "Your father's a coward. A drunk." Words that made crowds laugh, headlines scream. But in his heart, the fighter remembered mornings when his father went hungry so he could eat, nights when his father's hands wrapped his gloves despite bleeding knuckles. Coward? No. His father was the bravest man he knew. Drunk? No. His father's only intoxication was discipline. The outside world could not know this truth. But he carried it like fire in his chest. He would not defend it with words. He would defend it with fists. Flashbacks haunted him as fight week neared. He remembered the first time his father taught him to grapple, the mat cold against his skin, the man's arms heavy but guiding. Don't fight force with force. Use it. Turn it. Redirect it. He remembered nights when storms rattled their roof, but inside the gym, his father's calm voice was louder than thunder. "The world will throw chaos at you. Stay still. Let chaos burn itself out." And above all, he remembered the first fight he ever won. A small regional bout, the crowd barely 50 people. His father had stood in his corner, silent, eyes steady. The boy had finished the fight in one round. When his hand was raised, he looked for celebration. But his father only nodded once and said, "Good. Now train harder." That was legacy, not celebration, not ego. Legacy was humility carved into stone. The Irish fighter could never understand this. He mocked, he jeered, he shouted. To him, victory was measured by attention, by headlines, by money thrown across casino tables. But the Muslim fighter measured victory by silence, by respect, by honoring the man who gave him everything without ever demanding anything back. And so, as the press conference insult replayed across every screen, he did not break. He remembered his father's words, "Let them think silence is fear. But when the time comes, silence will be the weapon they cannot escape." Training intensified. Each strike carried the weight of memory. His fists echoed his father's guidance. His kicks cracked through the gym's stale air like thunder. Teammates noticed the fire in his eyes. He wasn't just preparing for a fight. He was preparing to defend a legacy. Meanwhile, the Irish fighter laughed louder. He boasted that he had already won. He bragged about breaking his opponent without throwing a single punch. To him, the silence was victory. To promoters, it was gold. But in truth, the silence was a storm gathering speed. Fight week crept closer. Fans debated endlessly. Some said the Muslim fighter was finished before stepping into the cage. Others warned that arrogance had blinded the Irishman. But no one knew the truth, except the fighter himself. He was not broken. He was sharpened. Every insult was another hammer strike against the steel of his focus. The night before weigh-ins, he sat alone in his gym. The lights dim, the heavy bag swaying gently from hours of punishment. He closed his eyes and heard his father's voice once more. "Son, remember, your fists are mine. Your silence is mine. What you carry into that cage is not just you. It is us." When he opened his eyes, there was no doubt, no fear, no hesitation. Only patience. Only silence. Only legacy. The world would see silence as weakness. But soon, the world would learn that silence could knock a man down harder than any insult ever could. The Irish fighter had made a mistake. He thought he was mocking a man. In truth, he had awakened a legacy. And legacies do not fall easily. The press conference was over, but its poison lingered in the air. The words of the Irish fighter spread faster than wildfire, carried by headlines, replayed endlessly in video clips, dissected by talking heads on every network. Each insult, each mockery, each twisted laugh was broadcast to millions. "Your father's a coward, a drunk." The soundbite echoed across televisions, radios, and phones. Fans in pubs shouted the lines in drunken celebration. Commentators debated whether the Irishman had already won the psychological war. Memes flooded the internet, mocking the silent fighter as if his calm were proof of weakness. Promoters loved every second of it. To them, controversy was currency, and this storm meant tickets, pay-per-view buys, headlines. They painted posters across cities, the Irishman grinning like a wolf, the Muslim fighter staring blankly, silent as stone. "The mouth versus the mystery," one slogan read. The narrative was clear. This was a fight between arrogance and silence, and the world was betting on arrogance. Sponsors flocked to the Irishman. His face plastered on advertisements for whiskey, sports betting, flashy cars. Interviews booked, late-night shows lined up, headlines praising him as the king of mental warfare. He reveled in it, his arrogance ballooning with every camera flash. Nights bled into mornings of celebration. He drank. He laughed. He told his entourage again and again, "I broke him. He won't last around." The Muslim fighter's camp was a different world. No laughter, no interviews, no headlines of mockery. Just sweat, silence, and discipline. The insults were fuel, poured onto a fire that burned hotter each day. His fists struck heavy bags like hammers. His grappling partners collapsed under the weight of his focus. Coaches whispered that he had never looked sharper. Yet outside the gym, the world believed the opposite. Silence was mistaken for defeat. He ignored the noise. Every morning still began with prayer, still ended with training. He didn't need to shout. His father's voice echoed in the quiet hours. "Noise cannot hurt you. Only doubt can. And you carry none." But the world wanted noise. Reporters swarmed him, desperate for a quote, a soundbite, anything to ignite a new headline. They shoved microphones in his face, shouted questions. "What do you think of his insults? Are you angry? Do you feel disrespected? Is your father ashamed?" He said nothing. He walked past them with eyes steady, jaw firm, silence unbroken. His refusal to engage frustrated the media. They twisted his silence into stories of fear. "Broken before the fight," one headline declared. "The quiet man has no answer," another sneered. They didn't understand. His silence was not surrender. It was patience. Meanwhile, the Irish fighter bathed in attention. Every insult became bigger, crueler. He promised a knockout in the first minute. He mocked the idea of his opponent even training. "He's weak. He's scared. He hides behind silence because he's got nothing else." The crowd laughed, cheered, roared approval. The media repeated it like gospel. But arrogance blinds. The Irishman's training sessions grew sloppy. Nights of drinking dulled his reflexes. His focus shifted from the fight to the spectacle. He rehearsed one-liners for his post-fight interview, imagining the crowd roaring as he mocked his opponent again. He didn't sharpen his strikes. He sharpened his insults. His team noticed the cracks. Coaches whispered concerns about his conditioning, his late nights, his fading focus. But he waved them off with a laugh. "Doesn't matter. 20 seconds, and he's gone." Across the ocean, the Muslim fighter whispered something similar, but with a different meaning. In the solitude of the gym, sweat dripping, knuckles raw, he muttered, 20 seconds. That's all I'll need. The same words, spoken worlds apart. One drenched in arrogance. The other forged in patience. The contrast grew sharper with every passing day. The Irish fighter louder, drunker, wilder. The Muslim fighter quieter, sharper, deadlier. The storm gathered force, though the world could not yet see it. Fans debated endlessly online. Some believed the Irishman had already crushed his opponent mentally. Others, watching the quiet man's eyes in silence, warned that arrogance was blinding the crowd. But the louder voices drowned the warnings. The narrative was too strong, too marketable. The fight was already written in headlines before it had even begun. Fight week arrived. Media swarmed both camps, demanding final words. The Irishman gave them gladly. He mocked, he laughed, he screamed into microphones. I'll end him in seconds. He won't touch me. Cameras loved it. His sponsors cheered. The Muslim fighter said nothing. Not one word. His silence frustrated reporters, angered fans, confused promoters. But in his silence was a vow. He wasn't ignoring them. He was waiting for the only stage that mattered, the cage. In the final hours before weigh-ins, the two men's paths nearly crossed in the hotel hallway. The Irishman, drunk on attention, shouted across the corridor. Tomorrow, I'll make you beg. Your father will watch you fall. His entourage laughed, echoing his cruelty. The Muslim fighter stopped. He turned his head slowly, eyes locking onto his opponent. For a heartbeat, the hallway went silent. No words. No emotion. Just the weight of that gaze. Then he walked on. The silence heavier than a scream. The Irishman laughed it off, but his smile twitched at the edges. For a split second, the silence had felt suffocating. But arrogance quickly drowned the unease. Scared, he muttered. He's scared. That night, as the Irish fighter rehearsed his insults in the mirror, the Muslim fighter knelt in prayer, whispering only to himself. One prepared lines for the cameras. The other prepared fists for the storm. And when the cage door closed, only one preparation would matter. The weigh-in was supposed to be routine. Just numbers on a scale, a formality before the violence. But with these two men, nothing was routine anymore. The world had been poisoned by insults, electrified by arrogance, and captivated by silence. Now, every fan, every reporter, every promoter waited for the moment when the fighters would finally stand face to face. The stage lights blazed hot. The crowd pressed forward like a living wall, their chants echoing off the walls. Half roared with Irish flags waving high, their voices sharp with laughter and mockery. The other half stood firm, chanting prayers, raising banners, their faces carved with pride and defiance. The arena floor felt like it was splitting in two, one side chaos, the other discipline. Backstage, the Irish fighter strutted in circles, hyped by his entourage. His smile was wide, but his eyes carried the manic gleam of a man drunk on his own legend. He slapped his chest, pointed to the cameras. Watch me end him tomorrow. First round. 20 seconds. His friends cheered, echoing his arrogance. Meanwhile, the Muslim fighter stood quietly in his corner. No cameras, no smiles, no entourage feeding his ego. Just stillness. He stripped down to his fight shorts, body sculpted by years of labor, scars etched across his skin like history written in flesh. His father's voice whispered in memory, "Your body is your proof, not your words." When his name was called, the Irish fighter swaggered onto the stage, raising his arms high, basking in the roar of half the crowd. He climbed the scale, flexed his arms, shouted curses across the stage before the announcer even read his weight. "I'm ready now," he screamed. "I'll put him to sleep tomorrow." The crowd erupted, chants of his name shaking the air. Then came the moment the crowd had been waiting for. The silent fighter's name. He walked slowly, unhurried, his footsteps steady against the floor. No grin. No gestures. Just calm. He stepped onto the scale. The announcer called his weight. Perfect. No hesitation. No strain. He stepped down, and the storm was ready to collide. The face-off. Two men standing inches apart, worlds colliding in silence and noise. The Irish fighter leaned forward, his forehead nearly pressing against his opponent's. His words hissed like venom. "Tomorrow, I'll embarrass you. Your father will see you broken. I'll spit on your name." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some cheered, feeding on the cruelty. Others shouted back in anger, voices lost in the chaos. The Muslim fighter didn't move. Didn't blink. His eyes locked, unwavering, calm as stone. His silence screamed louder than any insult. The Irishman grew louder, screaming, pointing, veins bulging in his neck. He shoved forward, palms slamming against his opponent's chest. The shove echoed like thunder. Security swarmed the stage, separating the fighters as the crowd erupted into madness. Fans threw insults, chants turned into screams, the room a storm of chaos. The Irishman screamed over the guard's shoulders, spit flying, rage boiling. "Scared. Weak. Tomorrow, you're dead." The Muslim fighter didn't resist the guards holding him back. He simply stood tall, eyes never leaving his opponent's face. Calm. Silent. The shove hadn't rattled him. If anything, it had revealed the Irish fighter's desperation. His silence was the heaviest weapon in the room. The chaos spilled outside the arena. Videos of the shove went viral within minutes. Headlines screamed, "Irish fighter explodes at weigh-in." Clips of him yelling spread across every platform, his insults repeated endlessly. Fans argued furiously online, some celebrating his dominance, others condemning his cruelty. But in every clip, there was one image that stood out, the Muslim fighter's silence. His unblinking eyes, his refusal to flinch, his calm in the middle of madness. To some, it was weakness. To others, it was terrifying. That night, the Irish fighter reveled in the attention. He replayed the shove on his phone, laughing with his entourage. "Did you see his face? He's broken. Tomorrow, I'll finish him in seconds." He poured another drink, his arrogance drowning out the unease that flickered deep in his chest. But unease lingered. In the stillness of his hotel room, when the noise of fans had faded and his friends had gone quiet, he remembered those eyes. Silent, cold, unflinching. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. Then he buried it with another laugh, another drink. "He's scared," he whispered to himself. "Scared." Across the city, in a quiet room far from the chaos, the Muslim fighter knelt on the mat, forehead pressed to the floor in prayer. His body ached from months of training, but his mind was sharper than ever. The shove hadn't angered him, it had confirmed everything his father had taught him. Noise burns itself out. Stillness lasts forever. He rose, wrapped his hands in tape, and began shadowboxing in silence. Each movement crisp, sharp, disciplined. He wasn't fighting for headlines or cheers. He was fighting for his father, for legacy, for silence itself. The weigh-in had been the Irish fighter's stage. Tomorrow, the cage would be his own. And in 20 seconds, the world would finally hear what silence had been waiting to say. The weigh-in had ended in chaos, but the storm didn't stop at the stage. It spilled into the streets. By nightfall, the city was no longer one place, it was two. Divided. Torn apart by pride, faith, arrogance, and silence. Bars filled with Irish flags pulsed with drunken chants. Men pounded their fists on tables, laughing as they replayed clips of the shove, the insults, the arrogance. "He's already beaten," they shouted, glasses slamming together, beer spilling across sticky wood. To them, the fight was a foregone conclusion. They believed the mockery had broken the silent man before the first punch was ever thrown. But across the city, in quiet cafes and packed community centers, a different crowd gathered. Families huddled around glowing screens. Fathers whispered to sons about respect, mothers bowed their heads in prayer. They watched the same footage, but they didn't see weakness. They saw patience. They saw restraint. They saw a man carrying not just himself, but generations of honor. The city became a battleground of voices. On one corner, chants of laughter and drunken bravado echoed through the night. On another, whispered prayers floated like smoke into the cold air. And in between, tension crackled like electricity in a storm cloud ready to burst. Journalists fanned the flames. Every headline screamed division. The silence of fear or the silence of focus. Talk shows turned the fighters into symbols, one of arrogance, one of dignity. Commentators argued until their voices broke, some praising the Irishman's mind games, others condemning his cruelty as dishonor. The promoters loved it. Conflict meant money. They paraded the chaos as theater, blind to the deeper storm brewing. They saw numbers, not consequences. Tickets sold out, pay-per-view orders surged, and yet the streets outside the arena grew more dangerous with every passing hour. In alleyways, fans clashed. Flags were ripped, fists flew, bottles shattered against the ground. One man screamed, "Respect the father," while another shouted back, "He's finished already." Police sirens wailed through the night, but the sound was drowned out by voices refusing to back down. For the Irish fighter, this was victory. He watched the chaos unfold on television in his hotel suite, surrounded by his entourage, whiskey in hand. "They love me," he grinned. "Look at them. Fighting for me already." He saw the division as proof of his dominance, blind to the fact that arrogance breeds enemies as quickly as it gathers fans. For the Muslim fighter, the division was heavier. He sat quietly in his room, hands wrapped, sweat dripping from training even late into the night. His team avoided the screens, avoiding the noise. But he had heard enough. He knew the fight was no longer his alone. He carried the weight of every voice that had whispered prayers in silence, every father who told his child that dignity mattered, every fan who saw in him the proof that silence was not fear. His father's teachings echoed again. The cage is small, but the world is watching. Do not fight for yourself alone. Fight for what they cannot take from you, respect. The city outside did not sleep. Chants carried through the night, faces painted with flags, voices hoarse from screaming. In the Irish bars, they promised violence, bets exchanged like blood oaths. In the other corners of the city, mosques opened their doors for late prayers, communities gathered to watch, to wait, to believe. It was no longer about two men. It was about what they represented. One man's arrogance had turned him into a symbol of corruption, pride without respect, victory at any cost. The other man's silence had turned him into a symbol of patience, humility, and the fight for dignity against mockery. The divide spread across borders. Around the world, fans took sides. Social media erupted into war zones of words, insults flying like punches, hashtags trending with fury. Some praised the Irishman as a showman, a warrior who broke opponents with his mouth. Others condemned him as a bully, a man who disrespected family and faith. The Muslim fighter, with his silence, became something larger than a competitor. He became a mirror for those who believed dignity mattered more than noise. As dawn crept closer, the city's tension thickened. Police patrolled the streets, breaking up brawls, dragging drunken fans from sidewalks. Yet still the chants continued. Still the arguments raged. Still the city refused to rest. It was as if the entire place had been swallowed by the gravity of two men locked on a collision course. The Irish fighter fell asleep with a bottle in his hand, laughter still buzzing in his ears. His entourage assured him the fight was already won. He dreamed of standing over his opponent, microphone in hand, the crowd chanting his name. The Muslim fighter didn't sleep. He trained until sweat soaked the mats, until his lungs burned and his fists ached. When his body begged for rest, he knelt and prayed. His silence was not weakness. It was a storm-building strength. He whispered only to himself, 20 seconds. The city was divided. Families fractured over dinner tables, friends argued in bars, strangers brawled in streets. The fight had outgrown the cage, it had become a war of worlds. And as the final night faded into the morning of battle, one truth was clear. Only one man could bring silence to the storm. The night before the fight carried a weight heavier than steel. The city pulsed with noise, a living storm of divided chants and restless hearts. But behind closed doors, two men lived in two different worlds. One drowned in arrogance. The other sharpened in silence. In the Irish fighter's suite, the music was deafening. Bass rattled the walls, laughter spilled into the hallway, and bottles clinked like weapons being drawn. His entourage filled the room, drinking, smoking, bragging. They replayed the weigh-in shove on loop, cheering each time, as if it had been a knockout. "You already broke him," one shouted. The Irishman grinned, shirtless, pacing like a caged animal. His fists shadowboxed sloppily, his balance unsteady from the whiskey. "Tomorrow," he said, slurring slightly, "tomorrow I'll humiliate him. I'll knock him out in seconds. And I'll laugh in his father's face." The room erupted in drunken cheers. He drank again, arrogance coating every word. The noise was intoxicating, but underneath, doubt flickered like a faint candle. He ignored it, burying it beneath bravado. Across the city, in a modest hotel room, silence reigned. No music. No entourage. Just the rhythmic thud of fists against a heavy bag hung in the corner. The Muslim fighter trained long after midnight, sweat dripping down his face, muscles aching from weeks of relentless preparation. Each strike was sharp, deliberate, controlled. His body screamed for rest, but his mind was calm. When the bag finally stilled, he knelt on the thin carpet, forehead pressed to the ground in prayer. His lips moved silently, words flowing not for cameras, not for fans, but for strength, for discipline, for his father's legacy. His father's voice lived within him, steady and eternal. Do not meet chaos with chaos. Meet it with patience. Meet it with silence. The contrast between the two men could not have been clearer. One wasted his final hours on noise, drowning in arrogance and alcohol. The other spent his final hours sharpening his soul, preparing his body, surrendering to silence. In the streets below, the divide was alive. Irish flags waved in one district, chants spilling into the night air, drunken brawls breaking out on sidewalks. In another district, prayers echoed through open windows, communities gathering quietly, watching and waiting. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, suspended between arrogance and discipline, waiting for the cage to decide. The Irish fighter's arrogance spilled into the early morning. He stumbled onto the hotel balcony, drink in hand, staring out at the city lights. "This is my kingdom," he muttered to himself. "Tomorrow, I'll show the world." His reflection in the glass smiled back, but behind it, the flicker of unease returned. He shoved it down again, muttering curses at the silence he couldn't break. Meanwhile, the Muslim fighter finished his final prayer and lay on the floor, body stretched on the mat. He closed his eyes, breathing slow, steady. Sleep came not from exhaustion but from peace. He dreamed not of crowds or glory, but of his father's eyes watching him as a boy, teaching him patience, teaching him silence. He awoke before dawn, refreshed, centered, unshaken. Morning arrived, and with it, the final countdown. Cameras swarmed the Irishman as he left his suite, sunglasses hiding bloodshot eyes, entourage surrounding him like bodyguards. He barked at reporters, calling his opponent weak, pathetic, already beaten. He laughed through the hangover, convinced the performance would carry him through. The Muslim fighter left his room quietly. No cameras followed, no chants echoed. Only the sound of his footsteps on the pavement. He carried his gym bag in silence, head bowed, focused. The world didn't need his words. His fists would speak soon enough. By afternoon, both fighters were confined to the arena's back rooms, the storm about to break. The Irishman strutted in circles, rehearsing insults, his team hyping him louder and louder. But cracks showed in his movements. His punches against the pads were sloppy, his breathing labored. Arrogance was eating at his discipline. In the other room, the Muslim fighter wrapped his hands carefully, each loop of tape like a ritual. His coach watched in silence, understanding the weight of what was coming. No words were needed. Only patience. Only focus. The city outside was ready to erupt. Fans filled the arena, voices clashing, flags waving, chants colliding in thunder. It was no longer a fight. It was war. Two men carrying the pride, anger, and hope of millions. The Irish fighter believed the war was already won. He strutted down the hallway toward the cage, shouting, laughing, arms raised. Cameras followed, drinking in his arrogance. His fans roared, drunk on his confidence. The Muslim fighter walked slowly, deliberately, every step measured. No smile. No gestures. Just silence. The noise of the arena swirled around him, but he carried calm like armor. His silence was a storm cloaked in stillness. And as the cage door waited, two worlds collided in anticipation. The night before war had ended. Now, only the storm remained. Fight night. The city trembled with anticipation. Streets choked with traffic, bars overflowed with chants, and the air around the arena buzzed like an electric current ready to snap. This wasn't just a fight anymore, it was a reckoning. Two men, two worlds, carrying millions of voices into one cage. The arena itself was a monster alive. Lights cut through smoke like blades, music thundered from speakers, and thousands of fans poured into their seats, shouting, chanting, waving flags. One side sang drunken songs in green and orange, voices cracking with laughter and arrogance. The other side hummed with steady prayers, whispers of dignity and hope rising above the noise. The clash of cultures wasn't quiet, it was deafening. Backstage, the fighters waited in separate rooms. The Irish fighter paced like a man possessed. His entourage cheered, slapped his shoulders, shouted insults toward walls as if the enemy could hear them through concrete. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that wavered at the edges. His hands shook slightly as he shadowboxed, but he drowned the tremor with laughter. "Tonight," he said, voice echoing with whiskey-soaked confidence, "I'll end him. 20 seconds. I'll make his silence permanent." Reporters peeked in, cameras flashing, recording his bravado. He flexed, cursed, grinned wide. On the surface, he looked unstoppable. But deep down, beneath the noise, the silence he had mocked still haunted him. In the other room, the Muslim fighter sat on a stool, head bowed, hands wrapped tight. His coaches said little. They didn't need to. The silence was heavy, purposeful, unbreakable. He rose, stretched slowly, then began to move, jabs, hooks, footwork, every strike sharp, controlled, deliberate. His breathing was steady, his eyes locked on something invisible beyond the walls. He wasn't listening to the noise of the arena. He was listening to the echoes of his father's voice. "Do not fear the storm. You are the storm." When the time came, the walkouts began. The Irish fighter went first. The lights dimmed, then exploded into green and gold strobes. Music blared, a drunken anthem roared from the speakers, and the crowd erupted in madness. He strutted through the tunnel, arms raised, shouting, laughing, pointing at fans who screamed his name. Beer flew into the air, chants shook the roof. He beat his chest, screamed insults into cameras, soaking in every second of the spotlight. To him, this was victory already. He was the king of chaos, the master of noise. Every step he took into the cage was another step into the story he thought he was writing. Then the music stopped. The lights shifted. The arena's roar turned into a split storm, half cheering, half booing, half chanting prayers. The Muslim fighter appeared at the mouth of the tunnel. No strut. No gestures. Just stillness. His head was lowered, his steps slow, steady, deliberate. His team walked behind him, silent as shadows. He didn't look left or right. He didn't acknowledge the insults hurled from drunken mouths or the cheers rising from his supporters. His eyes were fixed only forward, on the cage, on the storm waiting inside. The crowd's noise was thunder, but he moved as if walking through silence. Cameras zoomed in on his face. Calm. Unflinching. The face of a man who carried something far heavier than fame. He wasn't fighting for attention. He was fighting for respect. For legacy. For his father. When he stepped into the cage, the air inside the arena changed. The Irishman bounced on his feet, grinning, shouting, throwing imaginary punches in his direction. But the Muslim fighter walked to his corner quietly, knelt for a brief prayer, then rose, his eyes locking across the cage. For the first time, the two men stood inside the same storm. The announcer's voice boomed, rattling the roof, introducing them to the world. The crowd split into warring thunder, half chanting the Irishman's name, half roaring prayers for the silent man. The sound was overwhelming, but inside the cage, silence lived between them. The referee brought them forward for final instructions. The Irishman leaned close, smirking, whispering curses. "I'll break you in seconds," he hissed. "Say goodbye." The Muslim fighter said nothing. He didn't even blink. His silence pressed against his opponent like a weight, heavy enough to shake confidence. They touched gloves, though the Irishman barely grazed them, pulling away with a sneer. The referee stepped back. The cage door slammed shut with a metallic echo that shook the air. The arena went still for a moment, a silence heavier than sound. Thousands of fans held their breath. Millions watching across the world leaned closer to screens. The storm was about to break. The Irishman bounced in his corner, fists loose, grin wide. The Muslim fighter stood still, his eyes locked, his breathing steady, his body calm. Two worlds, two lives, two legacies, about to collide in 20 seconds that would be remembered forever. The referee raised his hand. "Fighters ready." The Irishman nodded, smirk burning. The Muslim fighter simply stared. The referee dropped his hand. The bell rang. The arena exploded. The sound of the bell was sharp, metallic, final. It cut through the roar of the crowd like a blade. For a brief second, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos erupted. The Irish fighter lunged forward instantly, fueled by arrogance and adrenaline. His grin was wide, his voice loud. "Come on!" he shouted, fists swinging with wild confidence. He wanted the finish now, wanted to humiliate his opponent in front of millions. His punches cut through the air with reckless force, the sound of knuckles slicing wind louder than the crowd itself. The Muslim fighter didn't flinch. His body shifted slightly, calm, measured, every movement efficient. His eyes tracked the Irishman's shoulders, his hips, his feet. Silence sharpened his focus, slowing down the chaos until every reckless strike looked like a telegraphed move in slow motion. The Irishman's fists crashed against forearms, glancing off shoulders. He laughed, taunting as he swung. "Weak. Too slow." His voice echoed inside the cage, feeding his own arrogance. The crowd cheered, roaring with every punch he threw, even if it missed. Noise carried him, blinded him. But silence carried the other man. The Muslim fighter didn't answer. He didn't speak. He didn't react to the insults, the laughter, the noise. His breathing was steady, his guard tight, his stance firm. Every punch that missed brought him closer to his moment. His father's words echoed in his mind, "Do not meet chaos with chaos. Wait. Patience wins fights." 10 seconds passed. The Irishman kept pressing, throwing combinations that wasted energy as much as they created noise. His arms pumped like pistons, but his strikes were sloppy, desperate for the knockout he had promised. He didn't see the trap he was walking into. The Muslim fighter shifted, his feet sliding across the mat with precision. His eyes never left his opponent. The crowd screamed, the lights burned hot, the cage rattled with the force of bodies moving inside it. And still, he was calm. Still, he was silent. 15 seconds. The Irishman swung wide, his left hand looping clumsily, his right guard low. He wanted the highlight reel punch, the knockout to seal his mockery. He leaned forward, laughter spilling from his lips. "Fall!" he shouted, voice breaking under the weight of arrogance. But storms strike fastest when skies look calm. The Muslim fighter stepped in, his body moving like a blade through air. One strike. A sharp, clean counter. His fist snapped forward with precision, colliding with the Irishman's jaw. The sound was sickening, bone meeting bone, a crack that silenced the arena for half a heartbeat. The Irishman's grin shattered. His head snapped sideways, body stumbling backward. His arms flailed, his balance gone. The arrogance drained from his face in an instant, replaced with shock. The crowd gasped, half in horror, half in ecstasy. The Muslim fighter didn't stop. He closed the distance, calm but ruthless. Another strike, another explosion of force. His right hand thundered forward, crashing into the Irishman's temple. The man staggered, legs wobbling, eyes glassy. The cage swallowed his fall as he crumbled backward. The referee stepped in, but the moment stretched like eternity. The Irishman's arrogance dissolved into silence. 20 seconds. The fight was over. The crowd erupted, a storm of screams, cheers, prayers, curses. Some fans cried out in disbelief, others fell to their knees in triumph. The arena shook with the force of divided voices colliding in the aftermath of shock. The Irishman lay sprawled on the canvas, his body still, his mouth open but speechless. The man who had lived by words had nothing left to say. His entourage screamed from cage-side, their voices lost in the chaos. The Muslim fighter stood tall above him. His chest rose and fell steadily, his fists still clenched. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, calm, but it carried like thunder across the silent gaps of the arena. "Now speak." The words cut deeper than any punch. They echoed through the cage, through the crowd, through the world. The silence that followed was deafening. Millions heard it. Millions felt it. The insulted had answered, not with words, not with noise, but with silence turned into power. The referee raised his hand. Undefeated still. A storm that had waited, patient, silent, now unleashed in a 20-second reckoning. The Irish fighter rolled to his knees, dazed, eyes wide with disbelief. His arrogance was gone. His empire of words had collapsed. His fans went quiet, their chants fading into murmurs of shock. The Muslim fighter didn't gloat. He didn't taunt. He didn't scream victory. He simply bowed his head for a moment, then looked to the heavens, his father's voice alive in memory. Silence wins. The cage had spoken. The world had heard. And outside, the city that had been divided fell into stunned silence, waiting to see what came next. The moment of impact rippled through the arena like an earthquake. One punch, sharp, precise, merciless, shook the Irish fighter's body and sent shockwaves across millions of screens. For an instant, time fractured. The crowd froze. The cameras clicked mid-flash. And in that suspended silence, the arrogant grin vanished. His head snapped back violently, eyes rolling, knees buckling. His arms, once swinging wild with confidence, now hung useless, flailing for balance that wasn't there. The canvas loomed beneath him like a grave. The crowd gasped as one. The Muslim fighter didn't celebrate. He didn't raise his arms, didn't scream to the crowd. He advanced with surgical calm, his eyes locked on the wounded man. A second strike cracked against the temple, thunderous and final. The Irish fighter collapsed like a tower crumbling under its own weight. The sound of his body hitting the canvas was heavier than the roar that followed. The cage rattled. The world held its breath. 20 seconds. That's all it had taken. The referee lunged between them, arms spread wide. The fight was over. The arrogant man who had mocked, who had laughed, who had built an empire on words and noise, lay flat, his mouth open but empty. The arena exploded. Fans screamed, cried, prayed, cursed. Half the crowd erupted in triumph, tears streaming down their faces as prayers became celebration. The other half drowned in shock, their chants silenced, their bravado shattered. The Irishman's entourage pressed against the cage, their eyes wide, their voices frantic. "Get up!" they screamed. But he couldn't. His body twitched, legs kicking weakly against the mat. His eyes were glassy, lost, hollow. The fighter who had promised dominance was gone, replaced by silence he couldn't escape. And then, the moment that would be replayed for years. The Muslim fighter, calm and collected, stood above him. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His lips parted, and his words were low but carried like thunder through the chaos. "Now speak." The entire arena froze. The insult that had poisoned press conferences, the mockery that had divided a city, the words that had been hurled like daggers, now reversed, handed back in a whisper sharper than any blade. The crowd erupted again, this time not just in sound but in meaning. It wasn't just a knockout. It was justice. The cameras zoomed in. Sweat dripped down his face, his chest heaving from exertion, but his eyes were steady, his voice calm. Silence had spoken, and its words were final. The referee raised his arm, announcing him the winner. Undefeated still. But this victory was more than another number on a record. This was vindication. This was the crushing of arrogance beneath the weight of patience. This was legacy solidified in 20 seconds. Reporters scrambled, their notes forgotten, their voices trembling as they tried to explain the unexplainable. Commentators shouted over each other, calling it one of the fastest, most devastating knockouts in memory. Social media exploded, timelines filled with clips looping endlessly, the punch, the collapse, the whisper. But inside the cage, there was no noise for the Muslim fighter. Only silence. Only stillness. He knelt briefly, bowed his head, whispered a prayer, and then stood, his eyes rising to the ceiling as though searching for his father in the rafters. He carried not just victory, but honor. The Irish fighter lay broken, doctors rushing to his side, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The crowd that once sang his name now looked away, ashamed, embarrassed by the arrogance they had celebrated. The chants of "finish him" were gone. In their place was the sound of respect, for the man who had endured insults with silence and answered with truth. The knockout became a story bigger than the cage. It was no longer just sport. It was justice. A bully silenced. A legacy defended. A son honoring his father not with words, but with fists sharpened by patience. Outside the arena, chaos erupted in the streets. Fans cheered in victory, others fought in anger, but everywhere, the knockout was the only thing anyone could speak about. Screens replayed it again and again, the arrogant lunge, the calm counter, the collapse, the whisper. But for the Muslim fighter, none of that mattered. Fame was irrelevant. Headlines meant nothing. He walked out of the cage the same way he had entered it, silent, calm, unbroken. The crowd reached for him, screaming his name, but he didn't look left or right. His eyes were forward, his steps steady. He carried his father's legacy with him. And he carried silence as his crown. 20 seconds had rewritten everything. The Irish fighter, once drunk on his own words, now faced the bitter taste of silence. His arrogance lay shattered on the canvas, his empire of noise destroyed in less than half a minute. He had promised humiliation, but it was he who had been humiliated. He had promised dominance, but it was he who had been dominated. And the world would never forget. The cage was loud, too loud. The crowd roared, commentators screamed into their microphones, cameras flashed like lightning. Yet in the middle of the chaos, there was only silence. A silence that didn't belong to the fans, or the promoters, or the cameras. It belonged to him, the fighter who had carried it like a weapon. He stood tall, sweat dripping down his brow, chest rising and falling with measured rhythm. His opponent lay broken at his feet, surrounded by doctors, entourage members screaming for help. The Irish fighter's mouth opened, but no words came. Only shallow breaths, groans, and confusion. The man who had lived by insults now had nothing left to say. The Muslim fighter looked down at him, eyes steady, calm, merciless in their truth. Then, with a voice sharp enough to cut through the madness, he whispered the words that would live forever. "Now speak." The arena froze. For a moment, the storm of voices outside the cage collapsed into silence. Even the chants, the prayers, the boos, all of it was drowned out by 2 words. The cameras caught them, microphones captured them, and within seconds, millions of screens replayed them across the globe. The insult had been returned, not with mockery, but with justice. The Irish fighter groaned, rolling weakly onto his side, his arrogance shattered. He had nothing to say. His silence was not patience. It was defeat. The Muslim fighter didn't gloat. He didn't shout into the microphone or climb the cage in celebration. He simply stood still, his fists unclenched, his breathing calm. The moment wasn't about spectacle. It was about truth. His silence, once mocked, had spoken louder than words ever could. Reporters at cage-side whispered furiously, scrambling to rewrite their narratives. Hours before, they had painted him as broken, humiliated by insults, destroyed before the fight had even begun. Now they stared at the image of him standing victorious after 20 seconds of precision, his opponent silenced beneath him. The story had changed. The storm had flipped. The referee raised his hand, declaring him the winner. The crowd erupted again, half in jubilation, half in disbelief. His supporters screamed his name, tears streaming, prayers answered. His doubters sat silent, unable to explain what they had just seen. Silence had defeated noise. Patience had crushed arrogance. In the middle of the cage, the Muslim fighter knelt. His forehead touched the canvas, the same ground where his opponent now lay beaten. For a moment, the arena quieted, watching the act of prayer unfold in front of millions. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the humility that followed destruction. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was devotion. When he rose, the microphone was thrust into his face. Reporters begged for words, for sound bites, for emotion. The crowd screamed for answers. But his response was as measured as his fight. "I told you nothing before," he said calmly. "Because words mean nothing. Tonight, I spoke with my fists. I spoke for my father. And I spoke for respect." The crowd roared again, some cheering, others booing, but everyone listening. He didn't need insults. He didn't need theatrics. His words carried weight because they were rare, because they were true. Respect is earned in silence, he continued. Not in arrogance. Not in mockery. Not in disrespect. I was silent. And now, you hear me. The Irish fighter's entourage carried him out of the cage, his head slumped, his body broken. The contrast was brutal. One man left the arena in shame, the other left it in silence turned into power. Around the world, clips of the moment flooded timelines. The knockout. The whisper. The speech. Fans debated, argued, celebrated. Some called it justice. Others called it destiny. But no one denied it. The silence had spoken louder than arrogance ever could. Back in the locker room, away from the noise, the Muslim fighter sat on a bench, tape still tight around his hands. He closed his eyes, the roar of the crowd fading behind him. In the stillness, he heard his father's voice again. Patience. Silence. Respect. He had carried those lessons into the cage, and now the world carried them too. The fight would be remembered as more than sport. It would be remembered as a story of legacy defended, of dignity overcoming arrogance, of silence turned into thunder. And as the cameras replayed his whisper, "Now speak," again and again, millions finally understood. Silence wasn't weakness. It was strength disguised. The arena still trembled from the knockout. Fans spilled into the streets, voices clashing like thunder, flags waving like flames. But inside the cage, the chaos had quieted. The Irish fighter had been carried out, broken, silent, humiliated. The Muslim fighter walked away with steady steps, his silence echoing louder than chants or cheers. Backstage, the corridors buzzed with frantic energy. Reporters shouted into cameras, stumbling over words as they rewrote history in real time. One of the fastest knockouts in recent memory. The most humiliating defeat of his career. Clips of the knockout played on repeat on giant screens, the Irish fighter's collapse broadcast to the world again and again. The Muslim fighter sat quietly in his locker room, hands wrapped, sweat cooling on his skin. His coaches said nothing. They didn't need to. Victory had been delivered, justice carved in 20 seconds. He bowed his head in prayer, whispering thanks not for fame, not for glory, but for the strength to honor his father. Meanwhile, across the arena, the Irish fighter's camp was chaos. Doctors hovered over him, shining lights into his eyes, checking for damage. His entourage raged at officials, shouting about unfair stoppages, about flukes, about luck. But their words were hollow. The replay told the truth. His arrogance had fallen in less than half a minute. He sat slumped in the corner, head in his hands, unable to look at the screens replaying his collapse. His own insults haunted him, replaying louder than the knockout. "Your father's a coward. You drink like a peasant." Words that once made crowds laugh now crushed him like weights. He had mocked silence. Now he was its prisoner. The media wasted no time. Headlines flooded in. 20 seconds of justice. Silence destroys arrogance. The legacy of a father lives on. Commentators dissected every moment, slow-motion replays freezing the exact second arrogance met discipline. Analysts praised the Muslim fighter's patience, his calm, his precision. Others condemned the Irishman's recklessness, his drunken preparation, his arrogance turned into downfall. Fans, too, divided sharply. Some abandoned the Irish fighter entirely, mocking him for his humiliation. Memes spread faster than fire, clips of him shouting, "Say something!" Next to the knockout punch, his body sprawled on the canvas with captions like, "This is silence." Others defended him, claiming he'd return, that the loss was a lesson. But even his defenders couldn't deny the truth. He had been broken. For the Muslim fighter, fame arrived whether he wanted it or not. Sponsors called, interviews requested, social media flooded with millions of new followers. But he refused most offers. Fame wasn't his goal. His victory wasn't for the cameras. It was for his father, for the legacy mocked and disrespected. His silence in the face of arrogance had become legendary, and that was enough. Reporters who doubted him before now praised him. The silent storm, they called him. The man who let his fists speak. But he didn't bask in their words. Words had never mattered to him. Actions did. And his actions had spoken louder than any headline ever could. The Irish fighter disappeared from public view in the days that followed. His once loyal fans turned on him, mocking him with the same laughter he once used against others. His arrogance had built a kingdom of noise, but kingdoms built on noise collapse quickly. He drank alone, haunted by silence, replaying those two words in his head, "Now speak." He realized too late that he had been beaten before the fight even began, not by fists, but by patience. Meanwhile, the Muslim fighter returned home. Crowds gathered in the streets, chanting his name, waving banners, celebrating not just a victory but a statement. He stood before them briefly, raised his hand, and said only one thing, "Respect." The crowd erupted, their cheers carrying into the night. At home, he sat with his father. The old man's hands were rough, eyes heavy with years of sacrifice, but pride glimmered within them. "You did well," his father said quietly. "You fought not for anger, not for revenge, but for dignity. That is victory." The fighter nodded, humbled. He knew his father was right. The knockout wasn't just a fight won. It was a lesson shown to the world, that arrogance destroys itself, and silence, when carried with discipline, can conquer anything. In the weeks that followed, the story grew into legend. Documentaries replayed the fight, narrators speaking in hushed tones about the 20-second storm. Fans around the world remembered where they were when the knockout happened, how they felt when silence finally spoke. For the Irish fighter, redemption became a dream. He vowed a return, but the shadow of his arrogance hung heavy. His name, once cheered, was now mocked. He had disrespected family, faith, and legacy, and been destroyed for it. Even if he returned, the stain would remain. For the Muslim fighter, redemption was never needed. He had carried himself with dignity from the start. His legacy was not built in 20 seconds. It was built in years of discipline, of training, of silence. The fight was only the world's first glimpse of what he had always known. And so, the story ended not with noise, but with quiet. A quiet heavier than sound. A quiet that carried meaning far beyond the cage. Because silence, when sharpened by patience and guided by legacy, always speaks last. The storm was over, but its echoes carried far beyond the cage. The knockout had ended in 20 seconds, yet the story refused to fade. It replayed in headlines, in whispers, in arguments that spread across living rooms, gyms, bars, and prayer halls. It had become more than a fight. It had become a parable. For weeks, the world spoke of silence. Of how a man mocked for his restraint had used it as his greatest weapon. Of how arrogance, drunk on its own laughter, had collapsed in less time than it takes for a heartbeat to quicken. Clips of the knockout flooded every platform, looping endlessly, dissected frame by frame, immortalized in slow motion. The fist. The collapse. The whisper. "Now speak." The words lived on, etched into the memory of millions. Not because they were loud, but because they were the only words that mattered. They were the proof of patience, the triumph of dignity, the legacy of a father passed down through silence and delivered through fists. The Irish fighter disappeared into shadows. His name, once cheered in drunken chorus, became a punchline. He sought redemption, but redemption does not come easily to those who spit on respect. He trained in solitude, haunted by the silence he once mocked. But no matter how many punches he threw, he couldn't erase the image of his body sprawled on the canvas, nor the voice that had cut through his arrogance with two words sharper than steel. The Muslim fighter walked another path. He returned to his community, to his family, to his father. Crowds welcomed him like a hero, but he remained humble, silent as ever. When reporters demanded more words, more sound bites, he gave them little. "Respect," he said once. "Patience," he said another time. He let his fists, his calm, and his silence speak louder than any interview could. His father, proud but steady, reminded him, "Victory is not the end. It is the beginning. Arrogance builds mountains, but patience moves them." The son listened, as he always had, letting the lesson sink deeper than the cheers outside their door. The fight became a story told across generations. In gyms, trainers reminded young fighters of the lesson, "Don't be fooled by noise." In classrooms and cafes, people spoke of the night arrogance fell in 20 seconds. In quiet homes, Fathers told sons that respect was heavier than fists, that silence, when sharpened, can break through arrogance louder than any insult. The cage had been small, but its echoes reached the world. Years from now, the Irish fighter's arrogance would be forgotten, buried in the dust of wasted words. But the silence that crushed him would remain. Because silence, once misunderstood as weakness, had revealed itself as strength, as legacy, as justice. And so, the story closes not with shouts or laughter, but with silence. A silence that holds weight. A silence that reminds us all, true strength doesn't need to scream. It waits. It endures. And when the time is right, it speaks once, and the world never forgets. Don't forget to comment where you're watching from, like this video, and subscribe for more stories.